Number 1. Number 2. Number 3. And number 4. If you like the sound of those chord progressions, stick around to the end of this video because we're going to be breaking down not only the chords themselves, but why they actually work so you can take these techniques, steal them, and use them in your productions. What's goody good fam? If you're new here, welcome to the channel. My name is BruceBeats. I'm a multi-instrumentalist and producer, credits with a bunch of TV film companies and big brands and also major artists and producers. And my goal with this channel is to help you become a baller on the keys, specifically for your piano and your production. So that's why in this video, I want to not only show you some really cool chord progressions, but give you the understanding of why these chord progressions work so that you're not limited to just copying something that you learn off YouTube, but you actually have the freedom to take this knowledge and be fluent with it and be confident in the way that you can express yourself on the keys when you're in the DAW producing your favorite music. So with that being said, let's get right into chord progression number 1. So this song is in the key of E flat. If you don't know the key of E flat, here's the E flat major scale. And the reason this is important is because this right here is the grouping of notes that we're going to be using to make this song. We're basically going to just use these and we're going to ignore the rest. That's why scales are important. So the chord progression for this song is right here. Now I know this may look like a lot for the beginners, especially because there's so many flats and cymbals here. It's actually very, very simple. So don't let how complicated it looks confuse you. Just follow along with me here. It's quite simple. Now before I even start playing, I want to talk about one thing that's actually going to make this even more simple for you, especially when you start to think about music in this way. Instead of thinking about all of these as letters, we want to start thinking about these as numbers. So instead of thinking about A flat major, I'm actually going to think about this as the 4 chord. With this E flat here, instead of thinking about it as E flat, I'm actually going to think about it as the 1 chord. And that's going to allow me to take this and bring it into other keys really, really easily, and also understand what are the patterns that I can steal from this and then use it in other keys, in other songs, and I can recognize it when it happens in other records. So with that being said, I'm going to write out this first line with a mix of Roman numerals and just regular numbers in the way that I think about it. So this first chord is a 4 chord. This second chord is a 1/3. I'll explain that in a second. This third chord is a dominant 2. That's really the special one. And then this last chord is a 5 chord. So what do I mean by all that? Well, the first one is this A flat. This is a regular 4 chord. If I'm in the key of E flat here, okay, and I go 1 chord, 2 chord, 3 chord, 4 chord, that's where I start on, and that's where it comes from. There's so many songs that start on the 4 chord here, so you don't always have to start on the 1. So I have this 4 chord, and then it brings me down to a 1/3. As you see when I'm playing this voicing, this says E flat over G. The 1 chord, which is the E flat, over the 3rd note, which is G. 1, 2, 3. The 3rd note of the scale. So if I play an E flat chord over the 3rd note of the scale, that's G. And that's what 1/3 means. And that just works really well when you're going from 4 down to 3. And I actually just like to think about this as a 3 because the bass, that's what the bass is doing. 4, 3. I just happen to be playing an E flat on the top. So naturally, if I'm going 4 to 3, my bass is probably going to move down to 2 again. So typically I would have 4, 3, 2. But what makes this really interesting is that 2 chord. Instead of playing the 2 minor like it usually comes playing the notes of the E flat major scale, what they do is they make this 2 chord a dominant 2 chord. So instead of playing this A flat here, they actually play just an A natural. And so what this does is it gives you a dominant chord. And you can hear this chord, it's a little richer. It has a little bit more soul, a little bit more bite to it than just the regular F minor. That guy, I'm gonna put a star on it because it really makes this special. So if it was just a regular 2, we would have, which is cool, I mean there's nothing wrong with that, but having that 2 be dominant, like it gives some extra voice leading, There's some extra sauce with that note. And so that's one chord you're gonna wanna steal from this, and that's one of the reasons why this chord progression works so well. And then this is our last chord. So we have a B flat 7 sus chord. What does that mean? Well, check this out. Usually a B flat major chord is just, 1, 3, 5. We're all very familiar with this, I hope. But to make it sus, to make it suspended, sus gives you kind of is more of a floaty, vibey type sound, right? And it works so well on these 5 chords because the 5 chord is usually very regal and it has this tension that brings you back to 1, right? But sometimes this is too like Bach, it's too Beethoven, it's too proper to bring us back to 1, and we want something a little bit more smooth. So by simply taking this and making it a sus chord, it immediately injects some more smoothness into it, and then we can get back to 1. So how do we do that? Super easy. So if we have this major chord, all we're gonna do is instead of playing the 3, we're gonna take the 3 and move it up 1/2 step and play the 4th. So sus, instead of 1, 3, 5, is 1, 4, 5. Very, very simple. Gives us a suspended sound, which we can then bring back down. You see how lovely that is? So when we use it there on the 5 chord, we get this really nice resolution. It's like a smoother tension back to 1. That's our kind of first segment of this progression. We have 4, 3, 2 as a dominant, 5 as a sus, 1. I'll do it one more time without speaking just so we can experience the chords. And real quick, one thing I want to mention about these last 2, the 2, 5, and the 1. Making that 2 a dominant 2 gives you this A natural, then going down to the A flat, then finally going down to the G. So we get some extra voice leading as we go through that progression, and that's one of the reasons it makes that so smooth. So having a dominant 2 to a suspended 5 to a 1 is another reason from a bigger picture perspective why this chord progression works. Now let's take a look at this bottom line here. What we're seeing is essentially the same thing we saw before. We're going from this E flat, which is the 1 chord, to another 1/3 chord, and then we're going to the minor 6. So what we're having here is E flat as our 1, and again, the bass is just walking down, E flat, D, C. And that's another big takeaway. If we take a look at the bass for this entire progression, with the exception of this, right? We're just moving stepwise. With the exception of the B flat, we're just walking down. So a really great technique is just walking up the scale with your bass notes or walking down the scale with your bass notes and finding cool chords that work. That's a proven formula that's worked for decades. So coming back to exactly what's happening here, we have this E flat, and then we walk down to D.
To what?
To D.
To where?
To D.
I don't get it.
So we have this E flat chord, we walk down to D, but we play this B flat chord on top. So we have B flat major over D. And this is an inversion, but it gives you such a really great sound. You can hear there's a certain color to this chord, and that's why it sounds so beautiful. And then that just walks us right down to C minor. Beautiful, that's all that's happening there. So putting that all together, we have 4, 3, dominant 2, 5 sus, to 1, 1/3 walk down, to the 6. Now that you understand that, I'm gonna play the actual song one more time, just a little bit slower, so you can experience the science behind the art as it's playing. Really beautiful, right? Chord progression number 2, coming to a completely different vibe. This is Daniel Caesar's Best Part.
You're the coffee that I need in the morning. You're my sunshine in the rain when it's pouring.
Now this chord progression is in the key of D major. This is the collection of notes that we're going to be using for this progression. So understanding this scale, understanding this grouping of notes is really important because we can basically ignore everything else. Everything we play is going to be built on these notes. And quick side note, this is why it's really important to understand your scales, because if we look at the song that we just looked at, this is a completely different grouping of notes than what we're about to look at. But when we think in numbers, we can take these same exact number patterns and just put it over to D major and we'll get the same results. Food for thought. Now here's the chord progression for this tune. Much simpler than before. Again, we're gonna not wanna think about it just as the letters, but we wanna attach the numbers to this. So here are our numbers for this chord progression. We start with the 1, which is D major. And then we notice we go to the 5 chord here. So if I'm playing in D major, if I count up 5 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I get A. And if I'm following the chord formula, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and if I add the 7 on that, just sticking with D major notes here, not leaving the key at all, we notice that we have an A7 chord, we have an A dominant chord. But that's not what's written here. What's written here is an A minor 7 chord. And so this is a very common thing to do in soulful genres, is to take this 5 chord and make it minor. And there are reasons behind that are a little bit beyond the scope of this video. But the easiest way to really just think about it is, instead of playing the 5 as a dominant, just play it as a minor 9. Simple as that. Just play it as a minor 9 and it'll sound good. And so that's actually one of the reasons why this chord progression is so killer. Because on the 2nd chord of the progression, we immediately leave the key. Like already by the 2nd chord, they've made it interesting. So that minor 5 is super pivotal. And that minor 5 brings us over to this G major 7. It brings us over to this 4 chord. And that's a very common move. You can hear it just kind of has a natural flow into that chord. It feels natural. It feels natural to land there. And then last but not least, we actually go up to this B flat major 9. And again, B flat major 9 is not in the key of D major. And that's why this sounds so beautiful. When we surprise the listener by playing chords that aren't in the key, it keeps you engaged and it keeps you interested. And it's like,
Ooh, what was that? What just happened there?
so this chord progression,
In the key, out of the key. Come back in the key, out of the key. And so we get this kind of push and pull, this tug from one going to the other, and that's what keeps it interesting to listen to.
now I want to quickly explain this flat 6, because I'm sure some of you are like,
God, flat 6.
like, that just sounds kind of daunting, right? For whatever reason, it's so easy, dude. Don't let this fancy terminology confuse you. Let me show you how simple this is. It's literally 2 steps. So the first thing we need to do is find the 6. Okay, so if I'm in D major, I will just start with my 1. Again, we're thinking in numbers here, right? So if I start with my 1 and I count up 6 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I get B. All I'll do is I will flat this. So I'll just go down a half step. B flat. There you go. That's my flat 6. B flat. Wasn't that hard, right? It was 2 steps. Find the 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Flat it. B flat. Boom! And what they're simply doing here is they're playing that B flat as a major 7 chord, or a major 9 chord. So if you like the sound of that flat 6, all you need to do is find the flat 6 in any key you're playing in and make it a major 7 chord. Boom, you got the sound. As a matter of fact, let's do that real quick in a key that feels complicated for some people. Let's do it in the key of E major. And let's go ahead and play the scale, and then let's find the 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so I have C sharp. Now all I'll do is I'll flat it. So I'll just go down by 1 half step. C. C major 9. You see how simple that is? So now I can have that sound. So if I toggle back and forth between E major 9 and then that C, I can have that sound. It's literally not more complicated than that, and it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. If you're digging these sounds and you're digging this type of instruction, I actually have a free group that you can join where you will have direct access to me. I have a bunch of free courses, daily motivation and tips. You can come join us inside the Piano for Producers squad. Just click the link in the description and you can join the group absolutely free. Chord progression number 3, this is Bruno Mars, That's What I Like. So if you don't necessarily love Bruno Mars or Daniel Caesar or the rap song On My Block, that doesn't mean there aren't things that are happening inside the chord progression or inside the melody or inside the rhythm or inside the drums that you can take and learn from. I'm a really big advocate of learning the sounds you like because you like those sounds for a reason. So as an educator, I always try to find what my students like and give them material in that vein. And when I'm thinking about songs or materials to present to you, I try and choose the ones that have the most to pull from, that I feel have value regardless of whether or not the song is cool or you like it in its entirety. This specific thing of what we're focusing on, whether it be the chord progression or the melody, has some value that you can take from it. So if you don't like the song, whatever, there's still things that we can take from that song that we can use in our productions in the way that we want to use it. So with that being said, this song is in the key of D flat. This is one of the more involved keys. Here's our scale. And again, this is the collection of notes that we're gonna use. But you'll notice every single one of these, there's at least one chord that leaves the key. And that's what makes R&B and neo soul and soulful styles really cool and a little bit tricky for beginners. Because while you can make some really cool stuff just sticking within the key, when you leave the key, that's when things get a little extra saucy and extra spicy. And artists and producers who fall under that soulful umbrella, they like to do that a lot. So hopefully we can demystify some of that today.
That was a long ass tangent. You want to get to the actual song now?
Chord progression number 3, this is Bruno Mars, That's What I Like.
I got a condo in Manhattan. Baby girl, what's happening? You and your ass invited, so gonna get to clap.
So here is the chord progression for That's What I Like. And I know you're probably thinking, oh my God, that looks like a lot. It's only 4 chords, but there seems like there's a lot of scribbles on that page. It's only because this is in the key of D flat. And again, there's a lot of black keys in the key of D flat. So there's gonna be a lot of, writing the flat symbol almost on every chord, which just makes it look a lot more cumbersome than it is. So our first 2 chords are a 2 and a 5. Now we've seen this already. If we look back at Scarface, we kind of saw that 2-5. So here we have another 2-5. It just happens to be in a different key. But instead of making the 2 major and then the 5 sus, we have a more true 2-5 where we just have a minor 2 and then a 5. But notice we have the 5 sus again. So we're not playing that 5, regal and Beethoven like. It's too proper. We're playing that 5 suspended. So having that 5 sus, we can already see in just these 2 examples, is a very common technique. So those are our first 2 chords, 2 and then 5. And then instead of going to 1, they actually do a very common thing here where they go to that minor 3 chord. So if I'm in the key of D flat, which I am, if I go up to the 3 chord, 1, 2, 3, I get F minor. And this is actually a really great substitution for the 1. There's just something about this 3 chord that's similar enough to the 1 chord to make you feel like you landed, but different enough that allows you to keep going in the progression and works as a substitute. So instead of going 2 to 5 to 1, which feels very final, we say 2 to 5 to 3. Ha! And you see when we land on the 3, it almost like wants you to keep going. We can almost like hear the next chord. And so the next chord here happens to be B flat 7 altered. And I think maybe in the recording they do a B flat 7 flat 9. That detail is a little bit less important. What's really important here is that they're playing a B flat dominant chord. What they're playing here, number-wise, is a 6 chord as a dominant 7, which leads you back to the 2. This chord is a perfect chord to bring you right back to the beginning. It just makes this loop. Because if I'm playing an E flat here, if I want to get to this chord, B flat is the perfect chord to lead me back because it's kind of like a 5 chord going to 1. I'm not going to get too much into that, but just know that if you make the 6 chord a dominant chord, it brings you perfectly back to the 2. So we have 2, 5, 3, 6 dominant. This progression is just straight up jazz. 3, 6, 2, 5 comes from jazz. For example, if I just went 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. Doesn't that sound like a jazz song? Okay, I played another substitution there. But you can see how that kind of sounds like jazz, right? So what Bruno does here is he just switches the order of that and he says, "Just to Puerto Rico, take the ride and we go. I'll never make a promise that I can't keep. And you hear how that has like a pull, like this chord has such a pull to bring you back down there. That's why this chord progression works so well. It's really about that 6th chord. And what you notice here is we actually never play the 1. By never landing, by going 2, 5, the 3, and then the 6 as a dominant to bring you back, it's like we're on this ever constant like Ferris wheel. We're just on this circle that never ends. It's beautiful. And actually one other point to highlight with this one is that 3 chord, is using that 3 chord in the place of a 1 chord. So whenever you feel like you're going to the 1, let's say you're playing in C major, and then you go and you hit that C major, but like that feels too final, instead of playing the C major, 1, 2, 3, try going to E. Try going to that minor 3 chord, because this may give you some ideas to bring you into your next section or to bring you into your next chord, or just to add some variety to your chord progressions as the song is evolving. And chord progression 4, last but not least, we're gonna take a look at a song that I made for TV film, actually based off the chord progression we just looked at. I made this chord progression after I learned Bruno Mars's chord progression. And you'll notice it's very similar. I didn't even bother changing the key. I thought this was really cool to add as number 4 because it illustrates how you can take some of the techniques that you're learning and then just flip them a little bit and put your own spice on it using something you just learned as a reference. So this song is called Cocaine is a Hell of a Drug. If you want to listen to the rest of it, I'll leave a link in the description below. But with that said, here's the chord progression. I'm laughing because I know this looks like a lot, and this was also at a time where I was doing the most, and I really love harmony, so I just love to play with things, and sometimes my progressions end up looking like a bajumble of mess. But hopefully I can simplify this for you. It looks way more complicated than it is simply because of the key that it's in. So let's think about this in numbers. So you'll notice that my first 2 chords are actually exactly the same as Bruno's. He starts with a 2-5, so I'm starting with a 2-5. Now instead of going to the minor 3, I actually go to a 1/4. What does that mean? Well, similarly to the 1/3 that we played before, right? So if I were to play my 1 chord, D flat, and I put it over the 3rd note, 1, 2, 3, I'd have D flat over F. But if I put it over the 4th, 1, 2, 3, 4, it just gives this really open, ambiguous sound, and I like it. Instead of actually just playing the 4 chord, which feels a little more solid, when I play 1/4, it just feels more open. And so I really like that. And it's almost like a false sense of home. Here's another way to make the home not feel so much like home, because instead of going 2, 5, that feels so final, I'm still playing 1, but the bass isn't playing 1 anymore. Now with these next 2, you'll notice I wrote 3 and flat 3. And again, that sounds really confusing, right? But it's very simple. My bass is just moving down chromatically to get me back to this 2. Because as I was writing this, I knew I wanted to end up here again at this 2. That's where my loop was going.
Right? I knew I wanted to get back here.
So I had to think, how am I going to get back to this E flat? And that's the trick. When you're writing chord progressions, you want to think about where you're going. Because when you think about where you're going, you can understand how to get there. I know I'm going to end up back at this E flat. I'm coming from here. Hey, look at this. I can actually just connect this chromatically. This is one of my go-to moves. So what I decided to do was to play F7 altered, E major 7, and then it brings me back. And that's just some tricks that I've learned along the way, and I know those chords will work there. So playing that 3 chord as an altered chord works really, really nicely. And then playing that flat 3 chord as a major 7 chord, oh my God, this is just so beautiful. And again, flat 3, what does that mean? How do you get there? Well, it's very simple. If we're in D flat, I'll find my 3rd, 1, 2, 3, and I'll go down a half step. E. That's it, it's 2 steps. Just find your 3rd, go down a half step, and then you play that chord as a major 7 chord. It's not more complicated than that. So that's what's going on here in this first line. We have the 2, going over to the 5, We've seen this already. Down to the 4, just a little more special. Down again, down again, down again. Right? Very, very simple. And then now here we change it up a little bit and we go to this A diminished and then we hit B flat. Why did I choose A diminished here? Well, I knew that I was gonna end up at this B flat because I knew I had to finally bring it home somehow. If I look at the first line again, I had this 2 and this 5, and then when it was supposed to come home to 1, I decided to give you a false sense of arrival. Like we don't necessarily feel like we arrived, then we kind of keep going on this Ferris wheel, right? And then we have this 2 again, and then I was like, oh, okay, I could go to the 5, but then now I finally need to like land. So I can either land on this B flat or I can land on this D flat. Like there at this spot in the progression, I know I needed to land. And I didn't want to land on a D flat because like this is too happy. And so I wanted to land on something that was like a little more mean. And so I was like, okay, if I know I'm gonna end up at this B flat, how do I want to get there?
Quick clarification, it's not that I had to bring it home, because as we see with Bruno Mars's progression, he doesn't even play the 1 chord, but I just felt like I wanted to land there. As I was writing the progression, I just felt emotionally like, okay, this is the spot where I want to land. So I can either land on D flat and be really happy, or I can land on B flat minor and have it be a little bit, more aggressive. And so I knew that that's where I wanted to land, and then I just had the decision of how I wanted to get there.
And I know from learning a bunch of songs that one really cool way to get here, especially if like this is mean, I kind of want my passing chord to be mean as well. So if I go down a half step and I play a diminished chord, that's gonna bring me there really nicely. And I actually have a whole tutorial on this. I'll leave it in the description as well, so you can watch that tutorial because I'm actually just using that technique right here. And for me personally, I don't necessarily think about that as a number. I can, but how I think about it in my mind is just I'm a half step below as a diminished chord, and then I go into my 6. And then once I get to my 6, I just walk it down by half steps. Same exact voicing, a minor chord. This is a very common thing that you see in R&B all the time, so I just kind of rip that piece of vocabulary. And it just sounds really cool, and then that brings me to the top of my loop again. So here's what we have in total.
Going to the 4, then I walk this down. I end up at 2, then diminished passing chord. Then I hit this B flat, walk it down, da, da, da. And then I'm back at the beginning.
Do you see that? That's kind of my thought process as I'm putting this chord progression together. And one thing I really want you to pay attention to here is that I'm doing nothing crazy and I'm doing nothing special. All I'm doing is taking things that I've learned and putting them together in a way that maybe they've never been put together before and putting my own spin on it. So for example, this 2-5, we've seen it a million times. This walk down, chromatic bass motion, we've seen that a million times. This diminished passing chord into the 6, we've seen that and we've heard that a million times. This walking down of minor 7 chords, we've seen that and we've heard that a million times. This entire progression is just a puzzling together of different pieces of chord progression vocabulary. That's all it is. It's not magic, it's not rocket science. It's just a collage of different things I've learned over the years. And that's all any song is. When you learn enough songs, you realize people are just repeating the same things over and over and over again. The only problem is you don't recognize those patterns because you haven't learned them. Much like as I'm speaking to you right now, all of these individual words, I've used them. I'm just putting them together in this way right now to deliver this message to you. That's what this is. So here are the key takeaways from each one of these songs. With On My Block by Scarface, we had that dominant 2 to that 5 sus to that 1. Number 2, Best Part by Daniel Caesar. Main takeaway right there is that 5 chord making it minor and the flat 6 chord making it a major 7. That's what I like by Bruno. We have that 2-5, but instead we go to the 3, takeaway number 1, and then we go to the 6 as a dominant 7, takeaway number 2, that brings you back to the 2. And number 4, Cocaine is a Hell of a Drug by me, which the main takeaways here would be probably this walk down chromatically, right? This diminished passing chord, and then this walk down back to the beginning. And also thinking about music in these little pieces and in these little boxes so we can have all the different puzzle pieces that we can put together. If you're digging this, click that like and subscribe button. It helps the channel out more than you know, and it helps get this knowledge into the hands of producers who need it, just like yourself, absolutely for free. And you know what else is absolutely free? This freaking group that I just started, my G. Go ahead and click that link in the description so you can join my free Piano for Producers squad, baby. Till next time, I'll see you. It's Bruce Beats. Peace.